Yeah, life is hard, and it's really hard to just sit with that distress. Of course, we want to run away from it, but you're running, you never outrun it. You never outrun it.
Yeah.
So better to just embrace it. And when we do embrace it, it changes shape.
You're listening to Staring at the World with BoDeans, Kurt Newman, a T. Torrance Productions original podcast.
I think it was Lee Von Helm who said, feeling good, all the money in the world spent on feeling good. Well, we're going to talk about that today with Dr. Anna Lembke, MD, who is a professor of psychiatry at Stanford University. She's done a lot of research on addiction, so it's going to be really interesting and educational. She talks to me a bit about my problems, so stay tuned. Welcome to the show, everybody. I'm Kurt Newman. We are staring at the world with Anna Lembke, MD. She is a professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences, professor and medical director of addiction at Stanford University School of Medicine, as well as Stanford Dual Diagnosis Clinic, one of the first to sound the alarms on the opioid overprescribing. A couple books, best-selling books, Drug Dealer MD, the relationship between doctors and patients around prescribing controlled drugs, and her latest book, Dopamine Nation, Balance in the Age of Indulgence. Welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm so glad to have you here because I've been listening to your book, Dopamine Nation, for the last few days, and I found myself really connecting with a lot of stuff you said, not because I have a problem with addiction, but I grew up a child of parents who were alcoholics. So it's been around me for my childhood, and then I got into rock and roll music, and I was touring, and there were musicians around me who were addicted to substances my whole life, and I just have seen it my whole life. So I found everything you were saying extremely interesting and kind of spot on with how I've felt about it myself, growing up around it and seeing it firsthand, and somehow being around it like that so much, I am not that same personality. I don't know why exactly, but I've heard some theories on it. But I am not addicted to substances, and I think my only addiction would be the addiction of being stronger than substances, and that I can avoid being addicted to them. So that would be mine for the, compared to other people. I don't like the idea of something that could control me. And I remember growing up with hearing about things like heroin, and people would get addicted to it. And I just felt like, why would I even want to venture down that path, because it leads nowhere. So that's how I grew up. But I wanted to talk to you about it because it was really personal for me, and what I've seen in my life, and everything you talked about was so spot on. One thing I'd like to start with you, though, was I was so interested in you have such an academic career and awards, like a huge long list of awards for your studies. But how did you find your way to all of this? How did you find your way from a kid growing up, I'm not sure where you grew up, but into this world of I'm connecting with this, studying addiction and the process and what's going on in the brain and stuff like that? How did you come to that?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for sharing your personal history. I mean, I could have lots and lots of questions for you. I'm really curious.
Well, I was hoping you might.
Okay, great. Do you want to start there, or do you want me to? Yeah, well, let's just start there. It's interesting. It sounds like you're being surrounded with parents who were alcoholics, and then in an industry where there's a lot of substance use. It's almost like you defined yourself in opposition to that. And so I guess I'm just wondering, I mean, do you think, obviously the upside is that you yourself haven't become addicted to drugs or alcohol. Do you think that there's any downsides to that? Or were there any kind of not so great aspects of having to kind of like rigidly hang on to this identity that was not going to be?
that's the thing. I don't ever feel like I'm white knuckling it at all.
Yeah,
I
right.
mean, like if I like having a nice cold beer after a show, but if I try to drink a second beer, there's something inside just like, like it literally doesn't want to. Like I've never had the feeling or craving of I need this or I want this, or like where people around me would just drink into the night, till 5 a.m. till they go to sleep, and then wake up the next day and do it all over again. And I just never had that. I almost didn't fit in with the rest of them.
Yeah. So it's interesting because obviously there is an inherited or genetic component to addiction. About 50 to 60% of the risk of getting addicted is probably inborn, and it's complex and polygenic and isn't one gene, or even one trait. It's a mixture of things that we don't even know yet in science, exactly what it is. But it's, usually if you have a biological parent or grandparent with addiction, you yourself are at higher risk for developing addiction. And yet it seems, at least with this addiction to alcohol, you genuinely don't have a euphoric or particularly positive response such that you would want to do it again. But one of the main claims that I'm making in Dopamine Nation is that even those of us who are relatively immune to traditional drugs like alcohol may nonetheless, in the modern world, find ourselves vulnerable to the problem of addiction because there are so many more drugs out there, including drugs that didn't exist before, like video games, like social media, like online shopping, online pornography. And as I highlight in the book, I am not somebody who's been particularly drawn to drugs or alcohol. They don't do much for me. Caffeine doesn't even really wake me up. And yet I found myself getting addicted to romance novels, especially available, through the Kindle.
Twilight.
And of course it was, Twilight. Twilight was my gateway drug. And it was, it was a minor addiction, all things considered, but it was very clearly that same brain phenomenon. Right. So I guess the thing that I'm curious about in you is, given that we're living in this world where almost everything's become drugified, including, I might even venture to say, the music business. Right. Do you find that you also struggle with kind of compulsive over-engagement that's potentially self or other destructive?
Probably. I mean, I'm releasing a new record and I played every instrument on the record, right? I wrote every song, I played every instrument, and I even made the guitars on the record. So you could make the argument that, for me, music was an escape from the world. Like I was a very antisocial kid, didn't connect with the whole school system and how things were taught. And the moment I could escape into the music room, even as a kid, that was it for me. So absolutely, if I wouldn't have ever called it an addiction. To me, music definitely takes you to another place, and it's definitely a feeling of going somewhere else. And now I don't know if that's how people feel when they're doing drugs or not, but for me,
it is.
Yeah.
It is. Yeah. That's what people are looking for.
Yeah. Well, it's like a connection I feel with music. It's almost like I always felt songs were coming through me rather than from me, and so I just felt like this energy was connecting me to the universe a little bit more. And I guess I never even thought that people would do crack because of the same feeling,
Yeah. Well, yes. And so this is really, really interesting because I wouldn't, without knowing more about you, I wouldn't also call your engagement with music an addiction, right? Addiction is by definition maladaptive, pathological, the continued compulsive use of a substance or behavior despite harm to self or others.
Yeah.
And of course, your music has been positive for you and positive personally, positive professionally, positive spiritually. But even so, I think these are good questions to ask because, society condones certain types of energetic investments, for example, in like things like work, and professional success and making a lot of money. And we don't usually call it an addiction. And yet well, could we reframe it in that way? And are there things that we are actually sacrificing or giving up because we're overvaluing this one particular activity? So, I mean, these get into sort of more philosophical, or maybe even sociological questions, but those are things I wonder about.
Yeah. For me, I mean, even as a kid, I listened to the AM radio when I was a little kid, and I remember even at night I lived in Waukesha, Wisconsin, which was about 70 miles from Chicago, and at night you could pull in WLS in Chicago, and I would hear the music coming from there. And I'd sit there in bed listening to this DJ who had, kind of some reverb effects on his voice, and he sounded like he was somewhere magical, so, and music kind of took me to that magical place. I always said to people I grew up like feeling like this was going on somewhere, and I needed to get to wherever that music was going on because there was something real positive going on. But I find also that I write songs really about that same kind of searching, philosophical kind of perspective on things. Many, many songs I've written about kind of bringing people to a place of paradise inside yourself, or good things inside yourself that you don't necessarily have to find it somewhere else. So music was always that connection for me, how I could somehow fit in with the world, But here's the question about it. Does an addiction have to be like destructive then? Like if music for me is a real positive energy, So I wouldn't call it an addiction for that, right? Because it's not destructive like what I saw going on in my family with alcohol and inability to stop drinking and stuff. It was real destructive, and I see it tear people's lives apart with drugs and stuff. So,
yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. I think that we can't trivialize addiction by indiscriminately applying it to any activity that we spend a lot of time doing. And I would not, that's not what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I agree that if we're going to use the word addiction, we're talking about a form of psychopathology, right? A form of maladaptive and self and other destructive behavior. But nonetheless, I am intrigued by how our reward and motivational brain systems, which work the same way, whether we apply them to cocaine or whether we apply them to music, right? It's the same kind of dopamine process that's driving it, right? I mean, as early as your childhood and listening to that musical place and feeling transported and feeling like that's a place I have to get to, like that's, reward mediated. That's your brain signaling with a lot of dopamine as like, keep doing that, approach that thing, that's positive. So, you were, in a way kind of lucky that your particular brain felt that attraction to music and not to alcohol. But it could have just as easily been alcohol, especially given your parents. So one thing I'm curious about, though, is, for me, the great escape as a child was reading. And I think the experience that I had with books was very much the experience you have with music. And so, but for me, what I have experienced in my life, well, then I had this little romance novel addiction thing going on, and then I kind of had to stop reading those types of books. And now I find, and this is all leading to a question for you. Now I find, and this is what a lot of times what my patients will describe, is that the books that used to work for me and transport me, so mainly novels, really kind of don't work anymore. It's like I've burned out those neurons, or I've depleted dopamine in that kind of register.
Yeah, I know that.
And I'm wondering if you've ever had anything like that with music, where this space that was this wonderful escape for you, all of a sudden it seemed like kind of deadened or not the same, or somehow had lost its luster.
Our favorite energy bars are back. Thank you to Be Bold Bars for sponsoring this episode. I talk about this brand all the time because I not only love their delicious energy bars, but I love their story. Stacy Madison, the founder of Be Bold Bars, is also the founder of Stacy's Pita Chips. She is the ultimate snack queen, so if you love pita chips, you will love these bars. They have 4 flavors, and all of them are gluten and dairy-free. Be Bold Bars is offering a special discount for all of you to try their amazing bars. If you use the code BOLD, that's BOLD, at checkout, you will receive 20% off. That code BOLD for 20% off at beboldbars.com. I know you're all going to love them. The mistake I made with how perfect music was to me as a kid was getting into it for work. I had a friend who loved the wilderness. I was getting out of high school, and he just loved being out in the woods or hiking, mountains, all that stuff. And he didn't know what he wanted to do afterwards and after high school. And I said, well, you should be like a park ranger or something. Then you'd be in it all the time. And he's like, no way. I was like, why not? And he was like, I would never want to ruin it by making it my work. And so I will say that, like, the music business side of what I do brought a real kind of ugliness into it that I'm, definitely burnt out on the music business part of it. But when I wake up and I see my guitar sitting across the room and I pick it up and start playing, it's the same. I'm transported. I lose track of time. I just feel something positive is going on in the world.
That is so cool. That is so awesome that you have something so reliably, so reliably positive like that you can, that still works for you.
Yeah. Which, I wish
that's great.
I talk to people about all the time. I wish everybody could. Like, when my dad was drinking throughout his life, I talked to him about it many, many times, and trying to get him help. And I got the typical response from him of, I went and talked to someone and they said, I'm not an alcoholic, and he didn't, I imagine, really talk about how much he drank, or how important it was in his life, but he ended up literally dropping from it eventually. And so I wonder if finding these other avenues of positivity are ever helping, because in your book, I know you talk about just basically you got to come to a place where you stop. Whatever that destructive thing is, you have to find a way to stop it. And I can't remember the terms exactly you used. Oh, yeah, self-binding and stuff like that, Do you find, though, ever that giving people a replacement, like, learn a musical instrument or something like that, ever helps?
Oh, yeah, for sure. But you have to be careful, because cross-addiction can happen quite easily, where once you've been addicted to one substance or behavior, your brain is really primed to get addicted to another substance or behavior. So it has to be the right kind of behavior in order to not, lead to another addiction. And one of the main points I make in my book is that actually doing something that's challenging or effortful or hard, that requires regular investment of energy, and the reward is delayed, so it's not immediate, that's a much better way to get your dopamine, because it's much less vulnerable to the problem of addiction and compulsive overuse. And, when I talk in the book about doing a dopamine fast or stopping the drug or behavior for a period of time, one of the main things I'm trying to communicate there is that addiction is its own primary and progressive disease. And what I mean by that is that there are many doorways into addiction, right? People start using substances for all kinds of reasons, right? It might be trauma. It might be a psychiatric illness. It might be boredom. It might be poverty. I mean, there are a million reasons. But once you get into the vortex of compulsive addictive use, it's driven by its own physiology. You don't need a reason anymore to keep drinking. The reason you're drinking is because you're addicted to alcohol or whatever the drug is. Now, the mind will make up many reasons for why we keep doing our drug of choice, but those are really almost always rationalizations once we're deep in our addiction.
Sure.
Which is why I'm trying to emphasize that, you can do all the thinking in the world about why you're addicted. You can get all the psychotherapy analyzing your trauma. But at some point, in order to target your addiction, you have to stop using the drug. And you have to allow the brain physiology to change in order to be able to get the insight and ability to really objectively see the impact of that drug on your life, and also to reset reward pathways so that you can enjoy other more modest rewards. So that's one of the major take homes from Dopamine Nation. It's not to minimize like the impact of things like trauma or your social situation, but it is to say that at a certain point, to continue to try to solve that problem without stopping the substance use becomes kind of a way to rationalize continued addictive behaviors.
Yeah, and you talked about that, how, how you continue to use drugs and it gets harder and harder to achieve the dopamine you originally were getting from this. But there's by stopping it, could you speak to that resetting process that you talk about in the book? Because I'm not sure really people realize that that process of by stopping it, you're actually resetting your brain to feel good again, whereas continuing the addiction is kind of leading nowhere. It's getting harder and harder and harder to reach the place you're trying to get to. So maybe you could tell people more about that reset process.
Yeah, happy to do that. So what happens is anytime we do something that's pleasurable, rewarding, reinforcing, our brains release dopamine, our reward neurotransmitter, in a specific circuit of the brain called the reward pathway, which consists of the nucleus accumbens, the ventral tegmental area, and the prefrontal cortex. But no sooner have we increased that pulsing of dopamine, and by the way, we all pulse dopamine at a stable baseline level. Now, it's a different baseline for different people, but whatever our baseline is, when we do something that's reinforcing, we then release dopamine above that baseline level. But no sooner have we increased dopamine levels than our brain will adapt to the increased dopamine by downregulating our own dopamine transmission, not just to baseline, but actually temporarily below baseline. That's the come down before going back to whatever our baseline firing level was. And I use this extended metaphor of a balance in gremlins in the book. But what happens in addiction in the brain is that as we continue to do this substance or behavior that releases a lot of dopamine, progressively over time, we essentially wear out our capacity to release more and more dopamine, and our brain progressively compensates by downregulating our baseline dopamine firing so that we're in a dopamine deficit state.
Yeah.
So whatever our original baseline dopamine level was, it goes below that, right? So now we're in a chronic dopamine deficit state, which is essentially akin to a clinical depression, right? So the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any substance, or the universal symptoms of this dopamine deficit state, are anxiety, irritability, depression, insomnia, and craving. And once we've done that, when we've changed our hedonic or joy set point, that can take a very long time to reverse itself, which is why when people have stopped their drug of choice and they feel that come down, they can stay in that come down place for months, right, before their brain gets the memo that they need to start upregulating dopamine. And that's why people relapse. They're not relapsing because like they selfishly want to get high. They're relapsing because they want to feel normal, right? Like they're walking around in a dopamine deficit state. But the point of the dopamine fast is if you can wait long enough and not use and just get past that painful dopamine deficit state, eventually your brain will start to upregulate dopamine production, bring you back to your pre-addiction healthy dopamine levels. And then really, the sun comes out, because then like a very modest pleasure becomes pleasurable again. Our attention that had become so narrowly focused on just this drug of choice, the lens widens and simple things are enjoyable again. Yeah. So we recapture our capacity for joy just simply by abstaining from our drug of choice. And I see this all the time in my clinical care. Patients who come in depressed, anxious, can't sleep, can't concentrate. And they're like, give me a pill or tell me what the psychotherapy is. And I say, I get it, but really what you need to do is stop smoking pot every day.
Yeah.
Because as long as you're smoking pot, you're driving down your own dopamine, and no pill that I'm going to give you is going to make any difference. It never feels like that could be true, because in the moment when they're using the pot, they temporarily feel better, but really all they're doing is medicating withdrawal from their last dose. So if they can just abstain long enough, then they eventually reset dopamine pathway. And then I don't need to even, I don't need to give them an antidepressant. Just by not using, they've restored their capacity for joy.
Right. I've never been diagnosed with depression, but I can tell. Sometimes I wonder if it's what my dad felt too. I feel a heavy weight of depression lots of times, but for me, this is weird, but I felt like the depression, boredom, and things like that were all fuel that I could use for music, because I felt like if I felt these things, then other people feel them, and I can speak to them musically, and maybe if we sing about them together, we'll all feel a little bit better about them, But today, like you said, everybody's just taking a pill, about it, and I don't, those scare the hell out of me. I just wouldn't want to do it, I prefer to feel, I'm a little bit more of the Eastern mysticism type of thing, of where they said, like this was all important, not just feeling the good things, but feeling the bad things and experiencing them completely. Like we got this thing like depression's really bad, but if you're willing to get through it, I guess, maybe it's not so bad, or maybe if you, like I do, can use it for some fuel for something positive. Does that make any sense to you, or am I completely off in that theory?
No, that's, you're bringing up a really important point, which is that the meaning that we give to our experiences, whether they're pleasurable or painful, have a huge impact on how we experience the feeling, and also what we do about it. So the classic examples that I write about in the book are that Henry Knowles Beecher, who was a physician who studied the experience of pain in World War II in soldiers who were fighting on the front and had these horrific life-threatening wounds. And to his surprise, he discovered that in the immediate aftermath of these life-threatening wounds, 2/3 of these soldiers experienced zero physical pain at all. So they had like chopped off limbs. And yes, does that hurt? They're like, nope, I don't feel any pain at all. Which was like really a mystery. Yeah. But he eventually concluded that the reason was because the meaning for them of that painful injury was that, number one, they were alive. Yeah. And number two, they were probably going home. Yeah. Right. So it was, if we have a narrative that attaches a certain meaning to a sensory experience, it can absolutely change that sensory experience. A corollary to that is a very famous case report that I think I also write about in the book, about a construction worker who jumped on a giant nail. It went right through the sole of his boot and right through his foot, and he was screaming in horrible pain. They took him to the emergency room. They doped him up full of tons of opioids, screaming. Finally, they gave him enough opioids. He passed out. They, removed the nail from his foot. They removed the boot. And what they discovered was that the nail had gone right between his toes. Right. In other words, there was no actual tissue injury. He looked at his foot. He thought that the nail went through his foot. And so he experienced pain. It was real pain. He wasn't making it up. And so this relates to you in that because you're an artist and a musician, your suffering has real value for you. So when it comes upon you, instead of you feeling like, oh no, this is terrible, I have a mental illness, or I need to go see a doctor, or many other types of interpretations that we give to that kind of suffering in the modern world. Instead, you say, oh no, this is rich to be mined for good material for the songs that I'll write. Yeah,
and that we probably all feel it. It was universal, is what I felt. So I should be singing about it. And when I play shows, I do think it's healing for people, for everyone to get together and sing. I think it's an incredible healing process. I talk about that a lot on this podcast, but it's only because I think it's such an important thing for people to do. We in our society, it seems like we've lost a lot of our artistic culture. It doesn't have much importance anymore in the world. And I really think that's a huge mistake, that it serves such an important part of people's lives to be able to do creative, artistic things, even if it's just going out and singing with a band or a song that you really feel connected to and things like that. I think it's incredibly healing, so I'll probably continue to talk about it forever. I'd like to talk about my daughters a little bit because I believe you were in the social dilemma, correct?
Yeah.
And that has been bothering me. I stumbled onto the social dilemma when it was on, I think, Netflix, and I was just like, oh man, this is exactly what I felt about social media. You know, I have no skills in social media myself, but my daughters have grown up on it. And I literally, this is a true story, I watched it. The next day I went to my daughters and I said, I will give each of you $100 to watch this. And they did. They watched it. I paid them $100 to watch it.
You monetized it.
Because it's so important, but they still sit there all day long. And I just cannot get them to stop being just connected. So I guess my question is, what are we going to do? Or what does a parent do for a child who is just so locked into their devices?
Yeah, well, let me first say it's a challenge for all parents. You know, we're in this together and we're all struggling to figure it out. And so are the kids. I think the kids themselves are beginning to recognize that even though they struggle to get off social media, it doesn't make them feel good.
Yeah.
So I've got teenagers also, and this is kind of a growing recognition among young people, not just their parents. What I recommend in the book, again, is a kind of a dopamine fast to get some distance from the drug. And I do consider many different forms of social media a drug, that most people will use and not get addicted to, but some people will get addicted to, just like most people who drink alcohol don't get addicted to alcohol, but some will. So I do think that, it's hard to make your teenager do anything really once they're 14 or so.
Oh, yeah.
It's very difficult, but you can still have these conversations, talk about it as a family, establish some basic digital etiquette around where devices are allowed and where they're not allowed, because it's just not, you as a family don't consider that okay. And then encourage them to experiment with a digital fast, even if it's just 24 hours off their phone, to sort of observe their own brains and of the withdrawal that occurs and the FOMO and all of it. And sometimes that fasting, that dopamine fast in and of itself, can motivate people because they can recognize then the extent to which the device controls them and not the other way around, and the extent to which there might actually be other things out there that they'd rather spend their time on. A colleague to me just said that the average lifespan consists of 4,000 weeks. Now, I haven't done the math myself, but I believe him. And if you think about that, if the average lifespan consists of 4,000 weeks, that doesn't seem like very many weeks. So, one of the things that I do with patients, and I think it's worth doing with teens who have most of their lives ahead of them, is to just say, how do you want to spend your life? Do you really want to look back on your life and say, woohoo, I spent 2,000 of my 4,000 weeks on social media? Probably not.
Right. But I get the same response from my children as I got from my dad when I would talk to him about drinking. It's this denial, just like, oh, I put the phone down all the time. I never see him put the phone down,
Yeah.
But like any person who's addicted, the denial is such a huge part of it. Like they, if you could open up their eyes at all to step outside of themselves to see what it's doing. And according to social media, it's pretty destructive because they do feel like they're like almost not living. Like my daughters feel like if they're not like famous and doing something, on social media, like they don't exist.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's like it just blows my mind. How could you not feel so important? And here's the thing, a little more therapy. I have one other daughter who, talking about genetics, we raised her talking about my wife and I both have alcoholic people on both sides, and we were saying, you can't be exposed to alcohol and drugs because you just have too much of a chance to get hooked on it. Well, no, she's 21 and she does, in my opinion, have problems with drugs and alcohol, but her excuse back to me was, well, you told me I was genetically predisposed to this, so I figure, F it, I'm just going to go with the genetics and have a problem with that. And I was like, I can't tell you like what a failure I felt like at this. Here I thought I had been educating her their whole lives, and then they used that argument against me. And like I say, if I'm getting that argument, I'm sure many, many parents are. And what do we do for these destructive behaviors? Because like you say in the book, I mean, people are getting or wanting a pill for everything rather than you just saying, you know what, which is my interpretation too, you just need to stop doing it. If it's food, stop eating. If it's alcohol, stop drinking. Whatever it is, you got to stop doing it. But getting people to find that kind of desire inside themselves is hard. How do we get them to get to that place?
Well, I mean, with people with severe addiction, when they're in their addiction, it's very hard for them to have the desire to stop because the physiology to continue to use is really overwhelming, which is why doing things like an intervention or going to rehab for a month or living in a sober living environment, if you can get people to do that those are important options for people who really just cannot stop on their own. Once they have, a month or more of not using, they get their frontal lobe back online, and then people have at least a better chance of making, some kind of choice. Not that everybody will be able to overcome their addiction. I mean, it's clearly a life-threatening disease for some people.
Yeah.
But I do think we need that space before we can even hope that people will have the agency to make a choice, because in the throes of their addiction, that capacity to choose really gets greatly diminished. For what you can say to your daughters, I mean, I think a little bit too, I would say that, at some point, so another very common characteristic of people who are in their addiction is that they're always blaming other people for their addiction. And when people get into recovery, they stop doing that. And they begin to recognize their own agency and their own responsibility and what they've contributed to their life's problems. And when I hear a narrative that's all about I'm a victim, I know that person's deep in their addiction. When I hear a narrative that's a lot more about, doing at least what they can, to sort of improve their own lives, then I know that person's headed to recovery. So, without knowing more about you and your daughter, if your daughter's kind of saying that she blames you for that comment, she
blames me for my genetics, I guess, but her feeling was just that, or my point is that she's using it against me to say, why fight it? It's in my genetics. I'm just going to go with it. And to any parent, that's just like, oh my God, you don't know what to do about it. But it's a desperate place to feel.
My guess is that she knows it's going to press your buttons to say that, and that she gets something out of doing that. That's my guess.
Yeah. Here's some statistics. 100,000 plus drug overdoses in 2021. Between 1999 and 2020, 841,000 died from drug overdoses. 1 in 4 are taking antidepressants, and opioids killed more people than guns or car accidents combined. I'm just kind of lost. It's just like, how can we as a country not be really waking up to this and saying, we have to take this way more serious. We have to apply a lot more effort into getting out of this place. It can't be just about getting a house in the suburbs with a nice car. If you're living this, if kids are growing up feeling like this feeling of like, I have to find some way to escape it all.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think this is the modern plague. This problem of,
that's a good word for it.
This sort of infinite access to all these highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors. And one of the biggest risk factors for addiction is simple access, right? If you live in a world where, you have drugs
Yeah.
around you all the time, you're more likely to use them, more likely to get addicted. So I always talk about creating a world within a world, where we create these barriers between ourselves and our drug of choice, try to affiliate with other people who are not using drugs and who are cultivating a healthy lifestyle. And it's really, really tough. And I agree with you that we collectively need to think about what to do about this very serious and growing problem of addiction.
Yeah. No, I wrote a song on my latest record called How to Say Goodbye, and it was written around a person close to me whose son had overdosed and died. And it was just like, I wrote the song, feel like, how do you even say goodbye, in that scenario? It's become so big in our society now. So many people experience it. I don't even know, because as a parent, you think losing a child would be about the most painful thing you could ever experience. So I would say it is a plague. It is the new war. And I think why you're here today, why I'm so happy you're here today, is so that we get a chance to even talk about it and continue to bring it to people's attention instead of just letting it slide by. One of the things you were saying were pursuing pleasure, avoiding pain leads to pain, right?
Right.
That pleasure for its own sense is only going to end up leading to more pain. Can you explain that a little bit for me to people, or better than I could?
Sure. I mean, it's just basic brain physiology, and the way that our brains process pleasure and pain is that they work like opposite sides of a balance. And the more that we press on the pleasure side, the more our brains are going to compensate by weighting down to the pain side. And again, ultimately, our brains kind of get stuck, on the pain side, and we reset our hedonic or joy set point to the side of pain in order to compensate for all the exogenous sources of intense pleasure. And by the way, even traditional drugs are so much more potent and so much more ubiquitous than ever before. And quantity and frequency and potency all really matter. And then you've got new drugs, like TikTok, that never run out. So it's just this constant bombardment. And the only way that our brains can accommodate this fire hose of dopamine is to basically weight our brains to the side of pain, so that we're in this dopamine. And it's physiology. Like, it's not, it's not morality. I mean, you can write a moral narrative around that, but it's, brain physiology in response to a dopamine overloaded world. Yeah.
And you say, instead of escaping the world, which I do with my music as well, is to turn and just kind of experience it. Like you talked about, I think in the book, a girl who's smoking weed nonstop, and you asked her to stop for a month and stuff, or social media people watching social media and just stop. And she said, she noticed the trees and stuff for the first time and the outside world and stuff like that. And I think that's super important as well, is learning to be okay with what's just around you in the here and now, correct?
Yeah, I mean, so a couple, different layers to that. I mean, we are living in a time in history when we have almost infinite variety of ways to change the way we feel in the moment. And we've gotten very, very good at that. And the result is that we have unlearned how to tolerate even minor distress or discomfort, because we can immediately escape it, by eating something or smoking something or watching something. And again, the result is that we're changing our brains, and that we're losing our mental calluses for tolerating any kind of discomfort or distress. So, when I talk about kind of the need for a new asceticism, or a kind of embracing pain, what I'm recommending is that we stop trying to always escape our suffering and change the way we feel, and instead just allow ourselves to sit with that discomfort and know that it will be unpleasant. Because, a lot of times this idea, well, just be in the moment, be here now, this kind of Zen Buddhist, people are thinking, well, if I only knew how to do that, then if I could just be in the moment, I would feel great. I would feel like high, like levitating. No, it's not like that. Being here now means tolerating the discomfort of being here now and living in this world as a fallible human, who has to make it through life, which is hard. So that's it's a different frame, right? It's like, life is hard, and it's really hard to just sit with that distress. Of course, we want to run away from that, but you never outrun it. You never outrun it. Yeah. So better to just embrace it. And when we do embrace it, it changes shape. So I would say for you, you're writing, in a way, your music is this escape for you, and it's kind of like a drug for you. But in another way, you've integrated it with like the real life painful things, like your friend's loss of their child. And so
I see it as a bit of a mission to what I've said to people before is I'm trying to put more positive energy out in the world than negative. I'm trying to not just take, from the world. Like a lot of people, they get into business, make a lot of money, and it just seems like they're all about like taking rather than giving. And my goal with music was more, it wasn't, I didn't think I was ever going to be rich from playing music. I thought I could do something positive with this time I had here. And so that's been my mission. But at the same time, you do have bills and stuff. So you do have to face everyday life and stuff. I tell my kids there was a mantra I kind of always said to myself that was Eastern philosophy. And it said, basically, there's nothing to do and there's nowhere to go. And that was it, but you try to explain that to a teenager. Yeah. And they're just like, hard. Dad's crazy, and he doesn't know what he's talking about. But I think we really, as a society, should start doing that more, which is, I think, what you're saying, look inside, be okay with where it is. It's not always going to feel good, but it's okay that it doesn't feel good too. And that's what I'm getting out of the book, which is what I've always felt and connected to as well.
Right. And I think also, despite the fact that I'm a psychiatrist and spent my professional life having people look inside, I think that can also be overdone. Like at some point, it's like, no, stop looking inside. Look outside. Look outside. Look around you. Look at what are the things that you could do now? Simple things to just improve the space or do something for other people or make the world a tiny little bit better, in this moment. It's not about you, right? It doesn't have to come from you, and it doesn't have to feel, you don't have to feel like you want to do it, but what needs doing.
Yeah, exactly. Here's a side question and we'll just wrap it up. But after, listening to the book, I remembered a show that used to be on HBO called In Treatment and stuff. And after hearing about some of your patients, I have to ask you, has HBO come to you and ask you to write some shows because you have some very eccentric characters in there that have
So a couple people have, so there are a couple people who have approached me, but I don't know. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, because, and for people listening, you should go get the book. You can get it in audio or you can read it, but it's really entertaining and I find educational, and I really connected to it. And the last podcast I did, I had a guy on who was talking about basically ketamine type therapies and stuff, ayahuasca and things like that he was promoting to help people with addiction, to kind of shock them out of it and stuff. And that's, another possibility, but I felt like I connected with this a lot more as far as things I've thought in my life and felt about it, and from being around this type of behavior my whole life too. People who are looking for this escape in drugs, and there's nowhere to go. There's nothing to do. Just be able to be chill. So thank you so much for joining me on this podcast, and I'll be calling you up for some therapy.
No charge.
That'd be awesome. And thank you again so much.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure.
All right. Take care. Okay, that was my interview with Anna Lembke, MD. I really enjoyed it. It was nice to have someone interviewing me a little bit about, growing up with people around me and what I experienced. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Subscribe, rate, review, download, engage with it. We could really use you engaging with us. So otherwise, like I've said before, I'm just a guy sitting in a room talking to myself. So please join us, and thank you for joining us at Staring at the World. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Staring at the World with BoDeans, Kurt Newman, a podcast about creative innovation. Please be sure to download, subscribe, rate, and review, and keep listening wherever you get your podcasts.